Let's experiment with watercolors. Add some water to your paint cake to activate it or to wake it up. The first thing that I'm doing here is just using it directly from the little paint cake. So not adding extra water to my paintbrush. Notice that it has a nice clear line about it as I paint. The more I wake my paint up, the stronger the pigment, which means color, becomes. When I use my pink paint here, I'm putting quite a lot of color down on my paper, and then I'm adding some water to what is there. And notice how as you add water, the pigment or the color becomes less and less and less. So this is to show you the more water you add to your paint, the less bright it will be, the less vibrant it will be. The next thing I'm doing is putting water directly onto my page. And now I'm just adding pops of color onto the water. You'll notice that the paint stays within the water that I already put onto the page. So when you experiment, keep that in mind. Add some colors and let the water do its thing. You don't have to do much. The water and the paint does everything for you. This is one of my favorite techniques, I must say. Wet on wet. So wet paint on a wet piece of paper. Our next technique is called oil pastel resist. Add some oil pastel onto your page. I've done nice thick lines here, and then I also did some thin lines so that you can see the difference. The thicker and darker your pastel is, the more it's going to show up. Add some paint layers over your pastel. I used quite a watery consistency so that you could really see the pastel popping up. Notice that where I drew quite lightly with the pastel, it doesn't show up. So I really wanted to show you that there. But here I've got some thick lines again, and they show up quite nicely. For our next technique, I start by painting a block of plain color with my watercolor cakes. Once I'm happy with that block, I'm going to add salt to it. A little sprinkle of salt. Let's see what happens. We'll leave that to dry. I'm going to paint another block of color now using my orange paint. I'm using quite a lot of paint and quite a lot of pigment just because I really want to see what is going to happen when we add our next ingredient, make our next experiment. Our next experiment is using rice. So just as you did with the salt, adding some rice onto your painted block. I'll be leaving the rice to dry. I'm going to paint another block of color using my red paint this time. Lots of paint, quite a bit of water. I want a vibrant square of red. For this experiment, I'll be using cellophane or plastic wrap. I recycled this piece of plastic wrap from vegetables I bought earlier in the week. I knew I wanted to do this little project, so I saved it. I'm going to use the wet on wet technique again, blending two colors. So I start by wetting my page and adding a color onto one side and then I bring some more color into it. So I'm just letting the water and the paint do their thing and mix, and it's like a surprise at the end of the day. For this experiment, I'm going to place some leaves that I've found in my garden, and we're going to leave that to dry and see what happens when we reveal it later. I'll use the same wet on wet technique here with some water and adding 2 different colors of paint and just letting them do their thing, letting them blend however they want to. For our last experiment, we are going to use lemon juice. So just squeezing some lemon onto the wet paint and seeing what's going to happen when it dries. You could also use bottled lemon that you find in the shop. Now for the big reveal. I ended up putting a little lid on my leaves because I wanted them to really press down into the paint as they dried. Take off your leaves, your plastic wrap, your salt and your rice, and look at what you're left with, all these beautiful textures. So you can use these whenever you have a bit of time to experiment, or you can bring them into any projects that you do.